Hello folks, this is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Today I'm going to talk about the commonly invoked term Bothsidesism. The reason why I want to talk about this is because I think it relates to many of the ways that people have falsely analyzed issues in public affairs and attempted to study social problems from an incorrect perspective. There is nothing wrong with Bothsidesism. If I say that I dislike two sides, that's fine. If I say that I like them, that is fine. If I want to establish moral equivalency between two sides, that's fine. If I want to say that one side is worse in some areas, another side is worse in other areas, that's fine, or better in some areas, worse in other areas, that's fine, doesn't matter. That is called analysis. So there is such a thing as a logical fallacy. Let me go ahead and read them for you, and pardon me for looking away from the camera. One, for example, shifting the burden of proof, and I'm reading from my own work, arguing that something must be true because it hasn't been shown to be false. So, the example I give, I know that rock can read my mind. Who's ever proven that rocks can't read minds? That's shifting the burden of proof. The burden of proof lies on the person who is arguing for the ridiculous assertion that rocks can read minds. If I say they can't, I do not have to prove it. An appeal to authority, saying that an argument is valid simply because someone else has said so. No additional evidence is presented. Cracking your knuckles gives you arthritis. I remember I was taught that as a kid. After all, John Doe, MD, says so. First of all, that's not true, according to what I've read. But even if it is true, that's irrelevant. It's still appealing to an authority. Maybe you have evidence that it is. Well, in that case, you would need to produce the evidence. Simply making the statement without producing the evidence is an appeal to an authority. A hasty generalization. Arriving at a solution with insufficient or unrepresentative evidence. Drinking makes you violent. All my friends who drink get violent. It's also called an opinion. It lacks empirical evidence. It should be challenged and questioned. It is subjective. In other words, it's not based on empirical evidence. Then the corollary to that is called a sweeping generalization, also a logical fallacy, applying a general rule to an inappropriate situation. The crime rate has really gone up in the XYZ metropolitan area. Take Duganville, for example, not realizing that while the crime rate may have gone up in the XYZ metropolitan area, it has actually gone down in Duganville, wherever Duganville is. The fallacy of false cause. I'm sure I got sick because I went outside with a coat the day before. Actually, something completely different might have caused the person to get sick. What that does, that last logical fallacy, is it shows an incorrect understanding of causality or causation. To establish causation, you need three things. You need correlation, meaning two things have to occur in relationship to each other. When one occurs, the other occurs. Second, there needs to be time order. The first thing occurs before the second thing. And third, and perhaps most importantly, there has to be shown evidence that something else did not cause that particular event to occur. So the idea of fallacy, a false cause, very commonly used logical fallacy. Begging the question, using an opinion as evidence to support a conclusion. No one should eat meat because it is wrong to kill animals. This fallacy is also called circular reasoning. In other words, I supported an opinion with an opinion. Now, I'm free to believe that way, but that is not evidence. That is not logic. Appeal to force. This is an argument through threat. People who believe the way you do should be shot. I am right because I am bigger than you are. Okay, and perhaps the most famous logical fallacy, and the one most commonly invoked, an ad hominem attack. People often misuse the term or expand it beyond its original parameters. This refers to attacking one's opponent, not the issue at hand. I don't agree with your discussion of motorcycles because you're a communist. Obviously, whether a person is a communist or a fascist or a libertarian or a liberal or a neoconservative is irrelevant to what a person says about motorcycles. They're entirely unrelated issues. Okay, so I can go on and give numerous other examples of logical fallacies. I have them printed out in a booklet that I used to give to my students in preparation for discussing social problems, so that when we discuss them, hopefully another student who understood what these fallacies were would point out that something is a logical fallacy. Occasionally, I would interject and do it myself, but I usually tried to avoid that too much because I found when I did, my student reviews were negative in that area. I came across as dictatorial. So I often resisted my impulse to point out logical fallacies, even when I felt as though doing so was appropriate. Okay, now those are logical fallacies, meaning they are illogical. They contradict the rules of reasoning. What we talked about just before, Bothsidesism, is not a logical fallacy. Doesn't even come close. It's simply a way of expressing how one feels about something. Now, one could argue that if the statement is based on two opinions, maybe it might fit into what some people might call a hasty generalization, or perhaps even a sweeping generalization. But in and of itself, just taken by itself, with all other factors excluded from this discussion, Bothsidesism is not a logical fallacy. So let's apply that to something that is relevant in the world today. Let's talk about the war on Ukraine by Russia. The war was provoked by NATO. NATO made a promise, albeit not in writing, that it would not invade countries that were formerly a part of the Warsaw Pact, namely countries that were in effect extensions, although not actually member states, of the former Soviet Union. NATO violated that again and again and again. And so all of a sudden, Vladimir Putin looks around and he sees that most or many of the countries surrounding him are now a part of NATO. Then he discovers that Ukraine, his closest ally, was all of a sudden about to become a part of NATO and about to become a part of the EU after Ukraine met certain conditions. And what does Putin do? Should he just sit around and do nothing? Well, I'm not going to discuss it. What I think is irrelevant. But I can understand why Putin did what he did. I'll leave it at that. Now, whether his actions were justifiable, again, I'm not going to comment. Certainly, no one likes to see areas bombed, people dislocated, people killed massively, people who had nothing to do with what NATO did. But that's war, right? I mean, those kinds of things happen in warfare all the time, and there really is nothing else that really can be done about it. That's just war. So I'm not defending Putin, but I'm certainly not defending NATO. I am committing Bothsidesism. In other words, I'm saying that both sides are doing something wrong. But by the same token, I can understand why Putin did what he did, and I think there's some rationale to it. I can understand why NATO did what it did, because it's working with the agenda of building the American empire, but I don't agree with it, and I think it's horrendous. So that's Bothsidesism. It's not a logical fallacy, no matter what you may hear from people who insist that Bothsidesism is a logical fallacy. No, it's not. No, it's not. It's simply people saying what they think. I can agree with or disagree with as many sides as I want. It doesn't matter. It can be Bothsidesism, three-sidesism, four-sidesism, five-sidesism, whatever. All irrelevant. Has nothing to do with logic. In and of itself, there's nothing wrong with it. Now, you can disagree with a particular use of Bothsidesism, but it's your disagreement. Now, certainly Bothsidesism can be combined with logical fallacies. Sure, of course it can. But if you just take Bothsidesism by itself, without anything else added to it, which is basically all you can do in critiquing logical fallacies, otherwise you end up with too many complexities and too many contradictions, and you really end up talking about so many things at the same time that nothing you're really talking about makes much sense. Bothsidesism is not a logical fallacy. Okay, so the state of the first world right now can be looked at largely through the lens of Bothsidesism, I think. For instance, look at two of the major crises happening in the world today. Not the only ones, not even necessarily the most important ones, but certainly major ones. One, the war against Ukraine by Russia. In effect, the war against NATO by Russia, which is really what it comes down to. The other, the war against Palestine by Israel. Well, in both cases, I can critique aspects of those that I agree with and I disagree with. let's move on to the second one because we haven't discussed it. The war currently occurring by Bibi Netanyahu against Palestine. As I've said before, that war makes me very, very angry. The Palestinians are the indigenous peoples of that part of the world. They are the subaltern. They are the fourth world. But they are also the third world because Palestine, in effect, is an undeveloped, can't really call it a country, but a quasi-country. A place that should be a country, but because of Israel's opposition is not a country as of yet. And so I can say, well, certainly I think that what Hamas did in bombing Israel was bad, but I can also say that I can understand why Hamas did what it did. After all, much of Palestine is a prison camp. People can't leave. They're stuck there. I remember watching an episode with the great and late Anthony Bourdain in his CNN show Parts Unknown. Even though my views politically are different than Tony's, I agreed. I liked him personally. I just liked him. He's a very likable individual, I thought, and certainly he was fair-minded. He was Jewish on his mother's side and Roman Catholic on his father's side. This particular show was about Palestine and Israel. In the show, he had just been to Israel, where you could tell, against his wishes, his producers, it appeared to me, talked him into it, he got a bar mitzvah, an Orthodox bar mitzvah. He never had a bar mitzvah before, I assume. The look on his face, I mean, it was, he looked like he was being tortured. He hated it. He hated it. Nothing, not that he hated Judaism. I'm sure nothing. He's half Jewish. Nothing against Judaism, but receiving a bar mitzvah in a country which is treating Palestinians the way it is was obviously not pleasurable for him. Then he traveled over to Palestine. He was talking with this female race car driver, actually sitting in the passenger seat of the car. Walked in, and as he usually did, he said, "Hi, I'm Tony." And then she mentioned her name. In the course of the conversation, Tony said, "Do you ever have races with Israelis?" Her response, which almost made me cry at the time, was, "We are not allowed to by the Israeli government." That was her response. So, the tensions that exist in that area are primarily caused by Israel, not by the Palestinians. Now, does that justify everything the Palestinians have done? No. You can find things that they have done that are not so good, but generally I would say that the Palestinians are responding in self-defense. The Israelis, as a part of the First World, are responding aggressively. They are responding as a colonial power. They are a part of the American empire. They're not a part of NATO. That wouldn't really make much sense. Israel is not in Europe. But certainly they're a part of the American empire. And they might as well be in NATO. If Israel were attacked, certainly the United States would come to their assistance, which, how is that any different than being in NATO? It's only different by a technicality. So, again, am I committing both-sidesism? Well, people who support the doctrine of both-sidesism would probably say yes, because you're condemning both sides. Well, yeah. But I'm trying to do it in a very nuanced, analytical, logical, and critical way. That's fine. So, again, when looking at the current situation in the world today, where you have one country attacking another, and I could have brought up many other examples like the war between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, among others, we see that the world can be explained pretty well, actually, by both-sidesism, as long as it's done carefully and without bias and critically and in a nuanced fashion. So both-sidesism is not a logical fallacy. There's nothing wrong with it. In fact, I would say it's a good thing. It's a good analytical tool for understanding how the world operates and functions today. This is Mark, by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.